She was 23 years old, without property, without capital, and without a single relation willing to contest the will on her behalf, when the Duke of Casterholm's executor pressed a single folded document across a mahogany desk and told her she had inherited the Thornfield mares. There were 11 of them. She already knew, because the grooms talked, and grooms always talk, that 8 could not be raced, 2 would not be sold, and 1 had been lame in 3 legs for so long that the head stableman had taken to calling her the Monument, partly as a joke, and partly because he no longer expected her to move under her own direction. The executor added, with the particular warmth of a man performing warmth, that the estate would provide a stipend of 4 shillings a week for the mare's upkeep, which, as she calculated quietly and immediately, was sufficient to purchase hay for perhaps 6 of them for perhaps half a year. She thanked him, folded her copy of the document into her coat, and left the building before he had finished arranging his pen on its rest. But what the executor did not know, what no one in that building or that county knew, was that tucked inside the estate registry she had been handed without examination was a set of records kept by a woman who had managed that same string of horses 80 years before. And those records contained the precise reason every one of the Thornfield mares moved the way she did, and what could be done about it. If you have settled in somewhere comfortable, we are glad of your company. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from today. Her grandfather, Amos Vetch, had trained horses for 31 years at a yard in the north of Shropshire that no longer exists, absorbed now into a newer concern whose owners do not know the name of the man who built its drainage channels or laid its first course of stable brick. He had not been a fashionable trainer. He held no license to run horses at the principal meetings, had never sent a horse to Ascot or Newmarket, and once turned down a commission from a baronet on the grounds that the baronet intended to breed from a horse Amos considered structurally unsound and did not wish to be associated with whatever came of it. What he had instead was a particular and unfashionable conviction that a horse's movement was a text, that every deviation from the expected stride was a sentence in a language most people refused to learn, and that if you were willing to read that language slowly and without assumption, it would tell you not only what was wrong, but what had been wrong, and, more importantly, what could still be made right. He had developed this conviction across 3 decades of working with horses that other men had given up on. Horses bought cheaply at dispersal sales. Horses sent to him when no other option remained. Horses with histories of lameness so chronic that their owners had stopped expecting improvement and started expecting only the merciful end of the problem in one direction or another. He had returned most of them to work. Not to the work of champions. He was honest about what was possible and what was a fantasy, but to useful, comfortable, sound work. A horse returned to sound work was, in his private accounting, a victory more satisfying than any prize at any meeting he had never attended. He began teaching Clara when she was 8 years old, not teaching as a formal thing, not lessons at a scheduled hour, but teaching as a continuous practice of noticing, conducted alongside him as he moved through the yard each morning in the gray Shropshire light, stopping before each horse in turn, never touching first, only watching, his hands in his coat pockets and his chin slightly lowered, and his eyes moving from the horse's ears to its hocks in a patient top-to-bottom reading that he had described to her once as grammar check. You are looking for the sentence that does not parse. He taught her the names of every bone in the lower leg and the specific implications of heat in each of them. He taught her the 7 distinct regions of the hoof capsule and what changes in each region indicated about the structures above. He taught her to identify the footfall pattern of a horse compensating for pain in its opposite limb, which was a subtler and more common deception than people credited. Because a horse in pain does not limp simply and clearly in the manner of a man with a stone in his boot. It redistributes, it bargains, it finds arrangements that cost it less in the short term and more in the long. And the trained eye must read not the symptom, but the strategy. He taught her to read the wear on a shoe not merely as evidence of how a horse moved, but as a record of how long it had been moving that way and how deep the habit had become. When she was 12, he gave her a farrier's rasp and showed her how to take a fraction of an angle off a heel and what that fraction would do to the distribution of weight across a fetlock that had been carrying too much of its share for too long. He explained it to her in terms of a bridge, a description she later found in 3 separate engineering texts and understood him to have arrived at independently. Because he was the kind of man who arrived at correct conclusions by looking at things rather than by reading what others had concluded. The stone in an arch carries nothing, he told her. The joint in a leg carries everything. What you are adjusting when you correct a hoof angle is not the hoof. It is every joint above it, in sequence, all the way to the back. She did not forget this. It would come back to her years later, standing in a stable yard she had not yet seen, looking at mares she had not yet been given, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were standing on her left with his hands in his coat pockets. When she was 15, he gave her a copy of a French veterinary text, printed in 1831, which he had annotated in pencil across a period of years with corrections, confirmations, and in 3 places the notation simply wrong, underlined twice. She learned to read the French. The annotations were an education in themselves, not in veterinary science specifically, but in the discipline of reading a received authority critically, of holding expertise up to the light of specific evidence and seeing where it held and where it did not. At 16, she assisted him in a case that the local veterinary had declared hopeless, a mare with navicular changes severe enough that the vet had recommended humane destruction, and watched her grandfather work over the course of 4 months, adjusting the breakover, rebuilding the frog, managing the diet for body condition that reduced the concussive load on the damaged bone, until the mare was walking without observable compensation, and, 6 months after that, working in light canter. He did not comment on this outcome. He entered it in his own ledger and moved to the next case. When she was 18, on the morning of a Christmas that neither of them observed with particular ceremony, he handed her a pair of brass calipers, the kind used to measure the angle of a hoof wall, with her initials scratched into the handle by his own hand. The scratching was precise, each letter upright and evenly spaced, the work of a man who held nothing loosely. He said, without preamble, "The horse does not know it is lame. It only knows what hurts. Your job is to know what it does not." She did not understand this entirely on the morning he said it. She understood it entirely later, at a moment she could not have predicted, standing in a derelict harness room in Herefordshire with a candle in one hand and a ledger in the other, reading a dead woman's handwriting. Amos Vetch died in the February of Clara's 22nd year, of a pneumonia that arrived on a Wednesday and concluded its business by the Sunday following, which was the kind of efficiency he would have approved of in almost any other context. He left the yard itself to a nephew, a man Clara had met twice, who arrived on the Monday after the burial, wearing boots that had never seen stable mud, and an expression of careful administrative neutrality that she recognized immediately as the face of a person who has already made decisions and is arranging the world to match them. His name was Mr. Garnett. He told her, in the language of a man reading from a prepared text he had not written himself, that the yard would be continuing under new management, that her position as his uncle's assistant had been a personal arrangement between herself and the deceased, that he intended to staff the concern with credentialed men, and that he had arranged for a letter of reference to be prepared that spoke to her years of service in general terms. She listened. She did not interrupt. She asked, when he had finished, whether she might have a week to arrange her affairs. He said she might have 3 days, adding that he was being generous. She thanked him, which unsettled him slightly, and went to pack. The executor's office occupied the second floor of a building in Shrewsbury that smelled of sealing wax and cold radiators, a combination that Clara associated ever afterward with the particular atmosphere of rooms where outcomes are announced without discussion. He was a trim, colorless man named Forsyth, who wore a suit of such careful neutral gray that it seemed designed to be forgotten immediately upon leaving the building, and who had the professional manner of someone accustomed to delivering news that falls below the threshold of actual grief, but above the threshold of indifference, a narrow band requiring a specific and practiced tone. He had arranged the papers on his desk in advance, which told her he had expected this to be brief. He indicated a chair. She sat. He told her that, pursuant to the late Duke's estate settlement, she had been identified as the recipient of a specific bequest. Here he glanced at the document before him, as though reviewing a detail he had not expected to need. Specifically, the 11 broodmares currently stabled at the Thornfield Annex, together with their tack, their registration papers where applicable, and such harness and equipment as was currently held in the annex building. He paused. She said nothing, which appeared to require him to continue sooner than he had intended. He informed her that the estate would provide a supplementary stipend of 4 shillings weekly, payable quarterly, for a period not to exceed 18 months, at which point the arrangement would be reviewed. He laid the document on the desk between them with the careful placement of a man who has performed this gesture many times and knows that the next move belongs to the other person. She picked it up. She read it. She turned it over and read the reverse. She set it flat again and ran her finger along 3 clauses, not to indicate them to him, but to settle them into her memory. He watched this with the slight unease of a man who had anticipated either distress or gratitude and had prepared for both and received neither. She asked one question: were the registration papers current? He consulted a secondary document. They were, he said, for 9 of the 11 animals. The remaining 2 had lapsed registrations that could be renewed at her expense through the appropriate authority, the address of which he could provide. She said she would be grateful for the address. He wrote it on a slip and passed it across the desk. She placed it inside her coat beside the folded document. She signed where he indicated, in her full name, Clara Agnes Vetch, the letters even and unhurried. She stood. She thanked him for his time, which was a short sentence, but one she meant precisely as stated, time being the thing she had received and intended to use. He said something about hoping it would prove satisfactory. She was already at the door. She had been told the Thornfield Annex was 12 miles south of a market town called Ludstone, along a track that branched from the Hereford Road at a finger post missing its top arm. She walked it in a day and 3/4, carrying a canvas bag that held the French veterinary text, her grandfather's calipers in their cloth roll, a change of clothes, the ledger she kept her own accounts in, a small toolkit including a hoof pick, a short rasp, 2 probe needles, and a bottle of iodine solution. 4 days of provisions and, separated from the rest in an inner pocket, the estate registry she had been handed in Forsyth's office and had not yet had occasion to examine in full. The road south from Shrewsbury was well maintained as far as the junction at Craven Cross, at which point it declined to a packed dirt surface that carried the impressions of wagon wheels from a recent delivery and not much else. The air smelled of turned earth and, faintly, cattle, a familiar smell, one she had woken to for most of her life and that she had not until this moment considered something she might miss. The fields on either side were good grazing land, she noted. The grass color was right, the drainage appeared sound. There were no visible signs of ragwort or rush, which were the usual indicators of ground that had been neglected past a certain threshold of correction. She watched the land the way her grandfather had taught her to watch a horse. Broad attention first, then narrowing to the specific, each narrowing telling you something the broad view could not. A field that drains well has a particular quality of surface evenness in its lower quarter that an eye trained to look for it cannot miss. She had a habit, which her grandfather had given her, and which she had never tried to break, of assessing a piece of ground for its horse-carrying capacity before she assessed it for anything else. How it would hold in wet weather, where the footing would be sound in a canter, whether the fencing line ran with or against the slope. It was a professional habit, and also a form of attention that organized the world into a kind of grammar she could read fluently, and the rest of the world mostly could not. Past Craven Cross, the land began to soften, the hedges grew taller and less managed, and the farm she passed became progressively quieter and less painted. She saw two properties whose rooflines she examined as she passed, with an attention that had nothing to do with the properties themselves and everything to do with the habit she had been given. A roofline told you the priorities of the people inside. A roof in good repair over a house otherwise declining meant they were holding the line. A roof giving way over a house otherwise sound meant something had broken recently and had not been processed yet. The Thornfield Annex, when the finger post appeared, had no road sign at all for its turning, only a gap in a hedge through which she could see, at the end of a long field margin, a set of low stone buildings partially screened by an ash that had grown into the eave line and was pressing, with considerable patience, on the tile. She stood at the field margin for several minutes before walking the length of it. The buildings resolved themselves as she approached into a stable block of 8 loose boxes arranged in an L, a harness room at the junction of the L, a hay store with a collapsed roof section at the eastern end, and a small dwelling attached to the south wall of the stable block that might have been a head groom's quarters and might have been a tack room at some earlier point, and had been neither for some time. She stopped at the entrance to the stable yard and looked from left to right without moving. 3 of the box doors were hanging at angles that indicated hinge failure. The drainage channel across the yard center was blocked by compacted debris and had backed up to leave a standing wet patch across approximately 1/3 of the surface area. The pointing between the stones of the stable block wall had failed in several places along the north elevation, which was the elevation the weather came from, and moss had colonized the gaps. 2 of the stable windows were broken. 1 was boarded. The hay store roof, where it had given way at the eastern pitch, had allowed water ingress sufficient to ruin at least one section of the floor below it, and the floor of a hay store mattered more than most people understood, because a wet floor meant mold, and mold in stored forage meant a respiratory condition that settled into horses slowly and showed itself in their wind long before it showed anywhere else. She noted all of this in a sequence of single compound sentences in her mind, not as despair, but as a list, and lists were workable things. Then she noted one further thing. The harness room at the elbow of the L had a door that was not hanging, not broken, not boarded, and not mossed. It was shut. It was, in fact, the only door in the complex that appeared to have been shut deliberately, recently, and by someone who expected it to remain shut. It felt, she thought, less like abandonment and more like patience, as if it had been waiting for the correct person to come and knock. She did not open it that evening. She found the 11 mares in the boxes that still had working doors. 8 boxes for 11 animals meant some doubling, which was not ideal but was not dangerous in the short term, and the animals were fed, which meant someone from the estate had been making arrangements she had not been told about, which was useful information of the kind she filed carefully. She examined each mare in the remaining light, moving through the boxes in the order she had learned from her grandfather. Ears first, eyes, nostrils, then the sweep down the neck to the shoulder, the foreleg from knee to hoof. The hoof itself turned up in her hands and read like a page. What she found was not simple. The mares had not been neglected in the ordinary sense. They were fed, watered, and not obviously ill. But they had been managed without understanding, which was a different thing, and in some ways worse, because mismanagement left habits in a body that neglect at least left unformed. She found 6 with hoof angles that had been left to drift, 2 with one-sided muscle wastage indicating compensatory loading that had been going on long enough to alter the shape of the shoulder above it, 1 with a curb that had been allowed to calcify past the point of full correction, and 3 with no evident pathology she could immediately identify, which meant their problems were elsewhere, subtler, or not yet expressed. The monument, the mare the grooms had named for her immobility, was a dark bay with a broad, steady eye who stood at the back of her box and watched Clara examine her with an expression that could only be described as long experience of people who did not know what they were looking at. She did not show pain when the leg was handled. She showed something closer to polite resignation. Clara filed this away and said nothing, to the mare or to the night. She lit her candle in the small attached dwelling, which was dry enough and had a serviceable hearth and a window the right size to be a window, and she opened the estate registry. It was a bound ledger of the older style, marbled boards, the spine rebacked at some point with a different leather that did not quite match. She had assumed it was a property inventory, the kind of document an executor produces without reading, a list of structures and acreages formalized for transfer. And for the first 40 pages, it was exactly that. Then she turned a page and found that the handwriting changed. The hand that had entered the property descriptions was the careful, impersonal copperplate of a solicitor's clerk. The hand that began on page 41 was different. Smaller, more slanted, more considered. The hand of someone writing for themselves rather than for a record. She held the candle closer. The entry was dated to the autumn of 1841. It read, "I have begun this record separately from the main register because what I have found in the lower harness room concerns only someone who will come after me, if anyone does, and is not the estate's business to know." She read for 2 hours. Outside, the ash tree made its slow, patient argument against the eave. One of the mares shifted in her box. The candle was 3/4 gone before she set the ledger down and went to the harness room door with a quiet that was not stealth but purpose, and tried the latch. The door did not open. The lock was the older type, a warded lock with a keyhole large enough to pass 2 fingers through, and there was no key on the latch, or the frame, or the floor nearby, which she had expected after reading the record. She went back to the ledger and read the relevant passage again, which told her the key was not missing but placed, 80 years ago, in the one location the estate would never think to look. inside the mouth of the carved horse's head above the harness room door, which the estate regarded as decorative and she now regarded as a cabinet. She took her candle back to the yard. The carved horse's head was above the door at a height she could reach standing on the lower rail of the adjacent box, and the mouth, when she put her fingers inside it, contained a small rusted key on a loop of wire. It was, she thought, as good an address as any for something you intended a specific person to find. The door opened onto darkness and the smell of cold stone and dried lavender, which was not a smell she had expected. She held the candle in and let the light establish the room before she entered. It was small, perhaps 4 meters by 3, and it had been arranged. Not abandoned, arranged. A workbench ran along the far wall, and on the workbench, covered by a piece of oilcloth that had done its job for 80 years with some effectiveness, were 4 items set in a row. She uncovered them from left to right. A tin box of moderate size, soldered shut, which produced a sound when tilted that was dense and regular, the sound of stacked coin. A small wooden chest, locked, with a keyhole she did not have the key for and did not attempt. A record book bound in green cloth, the title written on the cover in the same slanted hand, Thornfield Mares, their conditions, their treatments, and the system beneath the east pasture, complete. And a letter, sealed with plain wax and addressed, in the same hand, simply, to whoever finds this. She opened the letter last. "I am writing this in the autumn of my 61st year," it began, "which is to say that I am writing it at an age when I understand what a thing is worth and what it costs to understand that, and neither calculation fills me with sentimentality. I was given this property for the same reason you were likely given it, because the man who controlled it did not know what it was, and because making a gift of a worthless thing to a woman who could not argue with the terms of it is a tidier solution to an inconvenient problem than acknowledging that the problem is the woman's right. My name was Eleanor Marsh. I managed these horses for 19 years. I made this stable, which when I arrived at it was in a condition I cannot describe charitably, into a place where 23 horses lived well, and 5 of them ran faster than anyone in the county had believed horses of their breeding could run. I am telling you this not to boast. I have passed the age of boasting, which is a considerable relief, but because I need you to understand what you are standing inside. You are standing inside something that was built on purpose by someone who knew what she was doing. And most of what she built is still here, under the ground, where they cannot see it. In the tin box, you will find what I accumulated across 19 years of careful management, which I was not permitted to remove when I was removed, and which I could not bring myself to convert and carry off because it did not feel like mine to carry. It is yours now. Spend it on the roof first, because the roof is always first. And then on the drainage, because drainage is the argument you make to the land that you intend to stay. The Green Book will tell you everything else. I have tried to leave nothing out. I wish I had known you. I suspect we would have understood each other without much explanation. Eleanor Marsh, October 1841. Clara sat on the workbench in the cold room and held the letter until the candle guttered, and then she sat in the dark for a time that she did not measure. She was not the first. The property had tried this once before on a woman who had not been defeated by it, and that woman had prepared for her, not knowing her, not knowing when or whether she would arrive, out of a care that was not sentiment but something more durable than sentiment, out of the precise and architectural love of someone who had made something and wanted it to outlast her. A predecessor, separated from her by 80 years and by the particular patience of a locked room. Clara Vetch folded the letter along its original crease and placed it inside the green book, and placed the green book inside her coat, against her chest, where she had carried the estate registry. The room around her was not cold. It was waiting. She did not open the tin box for 11 days. This was not hesitation. She had, in that time, work that needed doing before she could think clearly about resources. She mucked out. She assessed the structural priorities. She inventoried the tack. She sent a letter to the farrier in Ludstone asking for an appointment, and she began working through the green book in the evenings, reading Eleanor Marsh's notes on each mare in the string as though reading clinical case histories, which was precisely what they were. Eleanor Marsh had kept records with a thoroughness that indicated she had understood, even then, that her records might outlive the trust placed in them. Each entry dated, each treatment and its outcome noted, each observation about temperament or response annotated in a margin. The Green Book was not merely a record of horses, it was a record of a method, and the method was recognizably the same one Clara had been taught under a different name in a yard in Shropshire, which was to say that it was not a method at all, but an approach. The approach of reading what was there rather than what you expected. When she did open the tin box, on the evening of the 12th day, she counted the contents twice and wrote the figure in her own ledger. It was, by the standards of the world she had been operating in, a considerable sum. It was not, by the standards she immediately applied to it, a fortune. It was a foundation. She did not allow herself to think of it in any other terms. She allocated it on paper that same evening, following what Eleanor Marsh had called the hierarchy of permanence: roof, drainage, floor, wall, window, and then the work of animals. And she set aside a separate column for what she called trust capital, which was the portion she intended to spend on people rather than materials, paid in advance, because people paid in advance worked differently than people paid on completion, and the difference was worth the risk. She went to see Cornelius Payne on a Tuesday morning in April, 3 weeks after she had moved into the annex dwelling. He was a farrier and a sometime veterinary who had operated in the Ludstone area for 35 years, was known throughout the county as the most competent man working in his trade, and was also known as a man who did not suffer fools, did not accept foolish commissions, and had declined to work for the previous management of the Thornfield Annex on grounds he had never publicly specified, but which the farrier community understood to relate to the way the animals had been handled. He was a broad man of 62, with hands that were impressive even by the standards of his trade, and he received her in a yard that was an education in what order could look like. Every tool hung, every surface clean, the horses in their boxes standing with the quiet ease of animals that had been correctly managed for a long time. He told her, with a brevity she recognized as professional and not hostile, that there was nothing to be done with the Thornfield mares, that he had seen them at various points over the preceding years, and that whatever foundation they might once have had been sufficiently undermined by mismanagement, that restoration was a word that required qualification bordering on fantasy. She said nothing in response. She reached into her coat and produced the drawing she had made the previous evening, based on Eleanor Marsh's notes cross-referenced with her own examination findings. A careful, measured diagram of each mare's hoof angles as found, as required, and as achievable through a corrective program stated in months and materials. He looked at it for somewhat longer than she had expected. She said, "I will pay your rate in advance for the first month." He looked at the drawing for a further moment. Then he said, 6 weeks, Not 4 on the first 3. She said, 6 weeks. He named his rate. She said she thought that was fair. He looked at her once, directly, and said, "You trained under Amos Vetch." It was not a question. She said she had. He said, "All right then." He brought with him, on his first visit, a younger man named as his apprentice, but whom Clara quickly understood was his nephew, a quiet man of 31 called Daniel Payne, who had his uncle's precision and none of his conversational brevity. He had, in fact, almost no conversation at all, which was a trait Clara found entirely workable in the specific context of work that required sustained attention. Daniel had a secondary competence in harness repair and leather work that Cornelius had not mentioned, and that Clara discovered by accident when she found him in the tack room one morning during a rain delay, restitching a throat latch with a tension and regularity that indicated long practice and an eye that measured without measuring instruments. She asked him his price for completing the tack inventory and making good what was salvageable. He named one. She said yes. The second to arrive was a woman named Mrs. Howell, who ran the receiving post from Ludstone and who appeared at the annex gate on a Saturday morning with a basket containing a quantity of food that suggested she had been planning the visit for some time and had not wished to arrive unprepared. She was curious in the direct and unapologetic way of a person who considers curiosity a social service, and she asked 12 questions in the first 20 minutes before Clara had managed to answer 5 of them. Her knowledge of the district was encyclopedic, in the manner specific to people who have occupied the same position of information flow for decades, knowing not only what was true, but what had been true, and what the relationship between those two things was in each particular case. By the third visit, she had become, without any formal agreement being reached, the mechanism by which the annex communicated with Ludstone, and Ludstone communicated with the annex. The third arrival was a man named Arthur Goss, who was retired from the Jockey Club's registration authority, and who appeared not because he had been sent for, but because Mrs. Howell had mentioned the Thornfield mares to him in the course of a conversation she was having about something else entirely, and he had come on his own initiative to look at the registration papers, which he declared to be in a condition he found professionally uncomfortable, and which he offered to restore to order as a matter of what he called principled intervention and for payment in kind, specifically 1 month's hay. Clara said she could arrange that. A fourth figure arrived in midsummer without announcing himself, a retired veterinary surgeon of 71 named Mr. Holt, who had studied under a practitioner in Edinburgh, and who had heard of the Thornfield work through Cornelius Payne, and arrived one morning to see for himself. He stayed 3 hours, examined 4 of the mares without being asked, confirmed 3 of Clara's findings, and corrected 1, and departed with a standing offer to be consulted by letter on anything that puzzled her. The bonds of this community were not declared. They accumulated, instead, like the pointing between stones, each piece small, each piece load-bearing, the whole invisible until you tried to remove one of them. Eleanor Marsh's Green Book had contained, across 43 pages of careful notation, a description of a drainage and irrigation system that she had laid in the east pasture in the late 1820s, designed to draw water from a seasonal stream that ran through the property's lower boundary and distribute it through a network of clay tile pipes to a series of catch basins spaced across the field. The system, when working, had kept the east pasture in consistent grass through the summer months when the rest of the county's grazing dried and failed, which had been, as Eleanor Marsh noted without commentary, the primary reason her horses had remained in better condition through the midsummer period than any competing string in the region. The pipes had been laid by a man Eleanor named only as the Tyler, whose professional judgment she quoted 3 times, and whose surname she either did not know or did not record, and whose work, she noted, was done with the unhurried accuracy of someone who understood that he was building something that would be used by people he would never meet. The system had silted up sometime in the 1860s, to judge by the last date notation in the book, and had been assumed since then to be not merely defunct, but entirely gone, absorbed into the field over decades of plowing. Clara had read the descriptions twice, and then walked the east pasture on a dry morning in May, taking her time, reading the ground the way her grandfather had taught her to read a horse. Ground kept its history if you knew how to ask for it. The slight depression in the field's surface, the particular quality of the grass over the line where tile lay below, the point at which the seasonal watercourse made its turn toward the lower boundary, all of it legible, if you had the grammar for it. She hired 4 men from the estate of a neighboring farm for a week's labor, following Eleanor Marsh's diagram exactly, and they dug carefully and found the tile intact, silted but intact, because fired clay set correctly is not a material that suffers easily from time. They rotted the pipes clean over 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Clara opened the sluice gate at the head of the system, which she had rebuilt from Eleanor Marsh's drawing, using materials she had bought in Ludstone with a specificity that had surprised the ironmonger somewhat, and the water found its old course in approximately 40 minutes, which was about as long as it takes a thing that has been waiting to remember what it was for. By the autumn, the east pasture was producing a yield of grass that the Ludstone market dealer assessed at a rate that, set against the cost of the labor and the ironwork, suggested a margin Clara entered in her ledger with a steadiness that hid nothing and announced nothing. The system that Eleanor Marsh had built, and that no one had remembered, and that the estate had been sitting on without knowing it for 40 years, became the first independent recurring income of the Thornfield Annex. It was not a fortune, it was a rhythm. The weekly arrangement that settled into practice by midsummer was a Thursday evening in the Annex dwelling's main room, where Clara set out the accounts on the table and Cornelius Payne sat across from her and told her what he had done and what he had found and what he recommended for the following week, while Daniel worked on something in the corner that was never the same thing twice, and Mrs. Howell arrived at some point after 7 with information she had gathered that week through means she did not specify, and which Clara had stopped questioning. Arthur Goss attended when the papers required it, and absented himself when they did not, which was a form of professional discipline she respected. The table held the accounts and the plans and a pot of tea that Mrs. Howell produced from the basket she invariably carried and that the others invariably accepted. A delivery of provisions began to arrive from Ludstone on Mondays, from a supplier whose terms Clara had negotiated directly and whose reliability she entered in her ledger with the same notation she used for the drainage and the farriery: sound. The summer moved through its business, the grass growing, the pipes running, the mares slowly and verifiably improving across the measures she tracked each week, and the autumn arrived with the particular quality of light that the valley held in September, amber and level, landing on the stable yard stones in a way that made them look as though they had been deliberately chosen for that effect, though they had only been chosen for their price. She began exercising the 3 furthest recovered mares herself each morning, not yet running them, not yet thinking in terms of meetings or entries, but walking and trotting them on a circle in the yard and reading what she found in each stride with the same attention she had learned to give to the examination of a stationary animal, because a horse in motion told you things a horse at rest had learned to conceal. These evenings were not social occasions in the way that word was ordinarily understood. There was no declaration of friendship, no ceremony of belonging, No moment at which anyone said that what they were doing together was more than work. But the work was shared, and shared work, continued over months, builds a particular kind of trust that is more durable than announced affection, a trust built not from liking, but from knowing precisely what each person can be depended upon to do. By November, when Cornelius Payne told her, without preamble, as he put on his coat to leave, that the first 3 mares were ready to be evaluated for light training, she understood that this was a statement he would not have made if he had not become certain of the standard she required, and that becoming certain of that standard had taken him somewhat longer than the 6 weeks he had originally agreed to. The Ludstone people had begun calling her Miss Vetch by September, which was a form of address that marked a shift she had felt but not named. In July, she had been the woman from the annex, or occasionally the Thornfield woman, both of which were descriptions rather than designations. Miss Vetch was a designation. It implied that she was expected to remain. There was a shelf in the dwelling's main room, above the hearth, that Clara had cleared of the miscellaneous accumulation left by whoever had last used the space and had kept empty through the summer while the room was organized into a working place. On an evening in December, when the work of the year had concluded for a day and the horses were settled and the east pasture was dormant under a frost that had come in from the north that afternoon, she placed 2 objects on the shelf. On the left, her grandfather's brass calipers in their cloth roll, which she unrolled and laid flat so that the tool itself was visible, the pivot, the arms, the initials scratched in the handle, and which caught the firelight in the particular way that brass catches it, warmly and without vanity. On the right, the small wooden chest from Eleanor Marsh's harness room, still locked, the key to which she had never found and had never actively looked for, because the chest contained a privacy that was not hers to enter. She had established, in her own accounting, that Eleanor Marsh had left it closed for reasons, and that the reasons were sound, and that she would extend to a woman she had never met the same care for interior things that she hoped would be extended to herself. The calipers and the chest sat at opposite ends of the shelf, and she looked at them for a time without naming what she felt, because what she felt did not require naming. Her grandfather had given her the ability to read the world correctly. A woman she had never known had trusted her to use that reading. Both of those things were on the shelf, and the shelf was in a room she had made habitable by her own effort, in a stable she had made sound by her own knowledge, on a property whose ground held a system she had revived because a woman she had never met had written down everything she knew and trusted that the right reader would arrive. The fire was behind her. The frost was outside the window. The mares were in their boxes. There is a man in Shrewsbury who still holds the letter of reference he wrote for Clara Vetch in the spring of 3 years prior, in the careful, neutral language of a man who had decided in advance how little this particular matter was going to require of him. He has never updated it. He has never thought to, because in the economy of his attention she concluded at the moment she left the yard, and things that have concluded do not require maintenance. He does not know that the Thornfield mares have placed in 7 of the last 9 meetings they have entered, running under a name and colors he would not recognize. He does not know that the East Pasture water system has been written up, briefly and accurately, in the transactions of an agricultural society in Hereford as an example of a forgotten method worth recovering. He does not know that Arthur Goss, when asked at his club about the Thornfield Annex registration situation, now uses the word exemplary without irony. He does not know the name Cornelius Payne uses when he refers to the annex in conversation, which is a compound phrase in the local idiom that means approximately the yard that knows what it is doing. He intended for Clara Vetch to be an inconvenient loose end tidied into insignificance. He intended an ending. An ending occurred. It was simply not the one he had in mind, and he was not present to observe the distinction, and he never would be. He is not a cruel man. He is simply a man who looks at things and does not see them, and the world contains a great many more of those than it does of the other kind. She was 23 years old when she was given 11 lame horses and 4 shillings a week to manage them, and the world around her agreed, without consulting her and without particular malice, that this was the end of something. It was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something that already had roots, that had been waiting below the surface of a dormant field in a locked room for the right person to arrive with the right knowledge and the willingness to stay. What the powerful discard as worthless is worthless only to those who have not been taught to read it. Clara Vetch had been taught to read it by a man with brass calipers and a French veterinary text, and 31 years of horses the world had given up on. And she had been trusted into it by a woman she never met, who had prepared a key and a record and a sealed chest and a letter, not knowing if anyone would ever come, only knowing that preparation was the only form of love that outlasted the one who gave it. We hope this story left you somewhere quiet. If it found you at the right moment, pass it to someone you think might need it. And we leave you with this. Somewhere in what you have been handed that the world has already decided is worthless, is there something no one else knows how to read?